In Book 5, Chapter 3 of Wilhelm Meister, he speaks the famous words, "Even as a youth, I had the vague desire and intention to develop myself fully, myself as I am. I still have the same intention, but the means to fulfill it are now somewhat clearer." This desire and the clarity of the means to fulfill it, desire and representation, is what I'd like to talk about today. My name's John Noyes, and I'm here to guide you through the reading of all of Goethe's novels. We've already seen how in Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship, the sense of self, the idea of self-development and who Wilhelm actually is, it starts to take shape between two forces. The one being this vague urge, this vague desire to become that which he is meant to be, and then the other being the social forces all around which push him in a certain direction, which try to push him perhaps into a predetermined mold. So between inner urges and the voice of society, his self takes shape. Now the problem is that both of these voices are mediated by representation, and representation is unreliable for a number of reasons. So how does Wilhelm really know what his inner nature is? How does he know what society wants? How does he know what he wants? These are all questions of interpretation, interpreting signs, interpreting representation. And they all lead to the question, is he really developing, or is he simply acting out a part? Now, one of the reasons why Goethe's novel was read as being an epoch-making novel, a representative novel for the century, is that this points to certain deep philosophical and socio-economic and political problems which shaped the century. It's useful to go back for a moment to Leibniz, and I'm going to take a small detour and then come back to Goethe. I'm going to do that because some of Leibniz's considerations shaped the direction that philosophical and artistic conversations were going to take, and also that Goethe was very interested in Leibniz's thoughts. So the problem of Bildung, of self-development, arises out of a particular philosophical and socio-cultural set of ideas that Leibniz tried to articulate. And I think one of the central problems here is the question, what happens to truth as a guiding idea in human life after we remove God as a steering force intervening in everyday life of human beings? This is the question of the theodicy. Don't forget, this was not only a philosophical problem, this was not an abstract problem, this was a deeply relevant political question which affected the lives of basically all Europeans during the 30 Years' War, in the devastating struggle between Catholicism and Protestantism, a struggle over the correct mediation of truth. And the resolution of this was an interiorization of religion, a separation of church and state, and political religious tolerance. And in the end, religion becomes understood as an interior struggle and not as an armed struggle, at least ideally. Certainly in Book 6 of Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship, this struggle is the story which is told. Leibniz takes the question of the interiorization of religion, and he understands it as the question of how can we know the truth. This may be a problem for religion, it may be a question for religion, but if we set aside miracles and revelation, then it becomes a problem for logic. Now, true propositions can be demonstrated using analysis, where a predicate is contained in a subject. This is the so-called predicate in notion principle. And Kant's favorite example of this was the statement, all bachelors are unmarried. The predicate unmarried is contained in the concept of bachelor, and so through what he called an analytic judgment a priori, we can convince ourselves of the truth of this judgment. Same thing with the statement, apples are a fruit. But what happens when we take more complex statements, such as Adam ate the apple that Eve gave him, or Wilhelm decided to accept that Felix was his son? These statements are historically true if we accept the worldview that tells the story. In a way, we could say, if we willfully suspend disbelief. But the question still remains, could Adam have acted differently? Could Wilhelm have acted differently? And this question raises two central problems of great importance to Wilhelm Meister's apprenticeship. The first is the question of human destiny. How do we know if our actions are free? Could they not have been steered by some invisible intelligence or some predestiny, some fate? Remember Wilhelm asking this question again and again. And connected to that is the question of human freedom. How much freedom do humans have to determine their own actions? And remember also that this is the question that Goethe started Werther with. Now, Leibniz gave a specific kind of an answer to the question of fate and free will that leads directly to the problem of representation in Goethe. And I'm just going to return to Leibniz for a moment in order to come back to Goethe and the problem of representation in free will. Leibniz spelled out what he understood by freedom. For an action to be free, it has to be intelligent, spontaneous, and contingent. Intelligent means that the agent, or we could say the actor, it's quite a good word when we're talking about Wilhelm Meister's apprenticeship, the actor has to be aware of the situation sufficiently in order to make a choice. So Wilhelm can only leave the theater once he understands what the theater is, what it does, how it operates, how it affects his life. An action also has to be spontaneous. It has to arise directly out of the subject and not out of external force. Wilhelm has to leave the theater because he decides to, not because his father tells him he has to. And then finally, an action must be contingent. It has to be judged on its own terms and not as a general principle. We can say, for example, that given that particular moment in Wilhelm's life and those particular conditions that applied, he decided to leave the theater, and not as a general rule, at all times, in all conditions, all people should decide to leave the theater. But Leibniz ran into a problem here, trying to harmonize this idea of freedom with the idea of the predicate in the notion principle, which led him to claim that you could make statements like, it's a general principle that the person called Adam, offered an apple by Eve, chose to eat it, otherwise he is not Adam. Or that Wilhelm, faced with the proposition that Felix is his son, decides to accept the truth of this proposition, otherwise he is not Felix. Now this sounds like it's bringing fate back in through the back door, so what do we do about that? And Leibniz's answer to that question was that a person's self-understanding points towards who, in the eyes of God, or I guess we could say in the eyes of fate, they are in fact truly intended to be. So we carry around with us, if we are honest and introspective and perceptive, we carry around with us this vision of who we might be, a representation of our true selves. So we carry around with us this imagination of a God as a higher intelligence, an intelligence that knows everything, as someone who, in other words, is infinitely intelligent, also someone who is infinitely spontaneous, generating everything out of himself, and infinitely contingent, This is a paradoxical idea which says more or less that everything happens according to an inner principle. And we as human beings cannot understand the divine inner principle that drives the world, but the closest we can get it is to imagine the world as being perfectly ordered. So what this all amounts to is, in order to think human freedom, or to think about the possibility of human freedom, Leibniz imagines an infinite intelligence, an infinite being who possesses infinite freedom and infinite knowledge. So thinking human freedom, freedom of action, freedom to develop yourself exactly as you are, implies a mind which is larger than yourself. And in Goethe's novel, this mind is the narrator. But here the problems are transposed directly into the structure and the telling of the story of Wilhelm. And so if he is going to develop, he needs to see clearly what his choices are. This is clouded by the way intelligence works in the world. The way intelligence accesses the world is by evidence, by desire, and by representation. And let me talk about those three just for a moment. Evidence in judgments. Goethe is showing us constantly, every step of the way, the problems associated with making judgments in situations where there is insufficient evidence. Think of the following propositions. Felix is your son. Mignon is a girl. The harper is insane. The beautiful soul is moved by a desire for moral action. Marianne loves me. Philine saved her suitcase because she was lucky. This painting is a portrait of Natalia. But it's not only Wilhelm who faces insufficient evidences when making decisions. It's also the Count. The Count sees a vision of himself, and he's faced with the proposition: the person I see in front of me is me. And this indeterminacy of evidence also carries through to the theater. The person in front of me is Hamlet, or is it Wilhelm? The figure I see is the ghost of Hamlet's father, or is it who? On top of the problem of evidence in the theater, we have the problem of desire, and this is everywhere in the novel. Wilhelm is constantly faced with situations where his or another person's desire masks the truth of their judgments. I think this could be said of basically all of his relationships with the female characters, certainly Marianne, certainly Philine, certainly Teresa. And the fact that it colors certain of his relationships destabilizes all of the other judgments. We have the problem, is a decision based on this motion towards an ideal, or is it based on desire? And this problem leads straight on to the problem of representation. Wilhelm needs to read the world as a series of signs and base his actions on them. Otherwise, he's not going to see his path through the world as being a path of development. It's simply going to be an arbitrary series of events. We can think of a large number of examples that show the indeterminacy of signs. The fact that it's not entirely clear how to read representation. Think of the puppet theater. What exactly is the significance of it in Wilhelm's life? Think of Marianne's scarf, the note from the ghost that says, "Flee, young man," the slippers next to his bed, Mignon's clothes, or Aurelia's dagger. The meaning of any one of these signs is so entangled with Wilhelm's desire that it becomes hard to pin it down. So everywhere he looks, signs are unreliable as carriers of the kind of certainty he needs in order to make free decisions about how to live his life. How can he be sure of the direction his inner nature, or God for that matter, wants his life to take when evidence is always made up of representations clouded by desire. Indeterminate representations clouded by an indeterminate desire. And this is going to be the guiding problem in the next novel we're going to be reading, Elective Affinities. In Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship, this leads to a strange narrative game, which I'd like to talk about for a moment, because it's one of the things that makes the allure of the novel. So the question is, we've seen this, how to tell the story of a life successfully led. And this is closely related to the question of how to understand the writing process itself as an act of artistic formation. And here the word would be the same, artistic Bildung, creating an artistic image. So we can think about the novel as the process of the reader watching the writer, allowing the inherent qualities of the central character to develop, but at the same time pushing that character in certain directions where these inherent qualities are tested. In other words, the writer starts looking like the character's fate, mediated by the voice of the narrator. And the voice of the narrator is going to be, in this novel, telling us or constantly hinting at this function of the writer as the character's fate, the character's God, the infinite mind of the character. So the writer's characters are the illusion that he attempts to create by pulling the strings of the puppet. But at the same time, Goethe subtly and repeatedly allows his hand to reach down into the stage so we can see that it's not the puppet acting of its own accord. I suppose we could even think of this in terms of what Adorno and Horkheimer call determinate negation. So the narrator's voice is a determinate negation of the freedom of the character. And Matthias Pirholt claims that the awareness of illusion that starts to grow in Wilhelm's mind is the first step towards self-consciousness, and it's absolutely necessary for his self-development. It also begs the question of how to view the Tower Society, these puppet masters in the novel. And in Goethe, the narrator can't just let this happen. The narrator has to signal to the reader. The narrator has to put his hand down into the action and show himself to be doing this. And the way that he does this is through irony. The Romantic writer Friedrich Schlegel noticed this irony and commented on it in ways that I think are quite useful to think about. And I'm just going to read you what he says. The poet himself appears to regard his characters and events with such levity and moodiness. He almost never mentions his hero without irony, and from the very heights of his mind he appears to be smiling down upon his masterpiece. But all of this should not deceive us into thinking that he is not writing in holy earnest. And then later he goes on to talk about the irony that presides over the entire work. And he says, it should be made tangible to those who have the sensibility for it, and only by those who can read out loud and who understand irony completely. And he speaks of this aura of dignity and significance in the style of the time, and the aura that smiles at itself, this appearance of carelessness and tautology. And then finally he says that this novel not only judges itself, but describes itself. If we ask ourselves now where we find irony in the novel, we can identify a number of places. We find it, for example, in the narrative voice. This voice which usually likes to call itself wir, we, and It usually intervenes at the start of chapters or in moments where the action takes a decisive turn. We also find it in a certain play with temporality, changes of tenses, or in condensed narrative time. And we find it in a superior epistemological position where the narrator hints at a more comprehensive knowledge than the figures themselves have. Or also where we are given to understand that there is a certain blindness ruling the actions of the characters. In introducing this kind of irony into his novel, Goethe is pointing to a central lack, a central flaw in representation, a central problem in representation, and that is the uncertainty that it carries with us. The uncertainty whether representation is a clear window onto the world or whether it's a glass which is fogged by desire. Now, there is one thing that the human mind can do to, if not remove this flaw and this lack and this problem, at least to come to terms with it. And that is that through the activity of the creative mind, it's possible to point to the possibilities and the shortcomings of representation and to hold these in lasting images. One place where I think we can see this at work is the song that Mignon sings at the end of the novel. And an even more succinct statement of this, I think, is found at the end of the prologue in Heaven in Faust. And I'm just going to read you a few lines that are spoken by the Lord. He says, "But may true sons of heaven you delight in beauty's living richness. May the power of growth that works and lives forever encompass you in love's propitious bonds, and may you give the permanence of thought to that which hovers in elusive forms. That which is chimerical, which is uncertain, indeterminate, can be given permanence through artistic creation and through human thoughts. This is the task facing human life." Now, I'd just like to close with one final thought, which I think is one of the reasons that makes it worthwhile engaging with these ideas today still. This work of the creative mind in establishing permanent thoughts where there is chimera and uncertainty and indeterminacy, this is threatened, and Goethe saw this threatened at his time by the emerging capitalist world economy. Truth is a matter of presenting lasting images and lasting thoughts in a world that consumes them and destroys them, that capitalizes them. And the older Goethe gets, the more concerned he gets about this process of capitalization of the creative process. We're going to see him making very clear statements about this in Wilhelm Meister's Wanderjahre. So this brings us to a close for today, and next week we're going to begin with elective affinities. Until then, goodbye.